asked about what would you like to talk about, I thought about this topic, who won World War I? Partly behind all that there is a book project that I'm part of with the British Military Academy in Sandhurst, and they are producing a book called What is Winning? So what does it mean to win a war, really? And I think there's an interesting sort of contrast between those brief, short wars in the 19th century that actually seem to produce a lasting solution. And then World War I, which is huge, with millions of casualties, and no really clear-cut outcome. And that's why it's, in a way, far more difficult to say who won World War I than you think about at first glance. I mean, in the 19th century, and that is, of course, the mentality that statesmen and politicians and generals had in 1914, is that all those wars of the 19th century, they were very brief. You know, some politicians these days, especially in the European Union, they are fond of saying, well, nationalism leads to war. There's no real statistical evidence for that. I mean, the 19th century was the century of nationalism, with all sorts of nationalist movements coming alive. But what is the result? The 19th century was the most peaceful century for European history. If you started in 1815, after Napoleon, of course. I mean, Napoleon is an exception. But 1815 to 1914, there are a few wars, but they're very brief. If you say, look at our history, Austria-Prussia, 18th century, you know, Maria Theresa and Frederick the Great, la belle et la bête, as you might say in French. 7 years war, and 1866, not even 7 weeks, you know, and it's all over. And the question, who's going to lead Germany, has been decided. And the casualties, all right, even with the needle gun, and, you know, I'm living close to Radiskarove, so I know what I'm talking about, even with the needle gun, far more people die of the cholera than of killed in battle. So you have the same wars of Italian unification. Very brief. Even the first Balkan War, where you might say it's a war of Bulgarian and Serbian unification, even that, you know, the great powers say, let them start fighting and we'll see what happens. Well, before they've slept, you know, all is over. Turkey is lost. So you have all these brief wars that actually seem to have a result. It's like, you know, tossing a coin. Who's going to win? And that's lost. And then you've got World War I. And the question really is, who won that war? I mean, if you look at a map, just, you know, I'm a low-tech person, so I haven't brought any maps or any PowerPoint things with me, but you can imagine a map of Europe. If you look at a map of Europe in 1913 and in 1919, you'd think World War I was a war of Polish liberation. That is the big difference. Before 1914, there's no state. Of course, there's Russian Poland, there's Galicia, and so on, but there's no state that's called Poland. And afterwards, you have a fairly big state that's called Poland. You know? So that is, you might say the Poles are the winners. And of course, you might say the same about Czechoslovakia. There hasn't been a Czechoslovakia before the war. After the war, there is a fairly vibrant Czechoslovak state. But of course, both the Czechs and the Poles didn't really fight in the war as national entities. If anything, I mean, even with the Czechoslovak Legion, which is a great adventure in Siberia. I mean, this is really one of the big stories of the 20th century. Somebody has compared it to the Cortes, you know, conquering Mexico in 1519. You have a few 10,000 Czechs, and all of a sudden, they really hold the artery of a great power, and they are something to count. But the majority of Czechs probably fought for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not necessarily because they liked the empire, but because they had to. And for the Poles, it's similar. I mean, I don't think anybody has ever given a good count of how many Poles had to fight in the Russian army, how many Poles had to fight in the Austrian and the German armies, but roughly the same. And what the average Pole really wanted, no opinion polls in those days. We have these experiences in August of 1914, when Piłsudski and his Polish Legion march into Russian Poland with flying colors. And all of a sudden they realize, people don't seem to be pro-Austrian here, you know? The farmers couldn't care less about who runs the country. So you have two winners, in a way, of the World War I, who didn't really fight in the war as such. Then, of course, we have the clear winner, who's always been the winner throughout the 20th century, because there was no other alternative. That's the United States of America. I mean, that is a given almost. I mean, World War I is very much not so much a contest of armies, but a contest of political economies. And there's this simple rule of thumb during World War I. The German Empire produces as much steel as the rest of Europe put together. And America produces as much steel as the rest of the world put together. So once America enters the war, and once they really put their mind and their strength to it, there's no question they'll win. The question is just whether they will sort of go to all that expense to do so. But once they do so, they're bound to win. And it's quite obvious that without the intervention of the United States, World War I would have ended in some sort of stalemate. I mean, especially after the Russians drop out of the war, the Germans might even have won, but they would have won on points, not a knockout blow, you know. They could never have conquered Britain and so on, but they might have forced France to, you know, come to some sort of settlement. So American intervention is certainly decisive, and it's my belief that President Wilson did not want to enter the war. You know, some Germans have this idea, this, you know, financial conspiracy and all that. No. At the end of November 1916, Wilson and the National Bank, so to speak, of the United States, the Federal Reserve, they have a circular to all the investors in America saying it's no longer in the interest of either the American investor or the American state to buy British Treasury bonds, which means Britain's going to be bankrupt within half a year. And all that changes because the Prussian generals have this silly idea of starting unrestricted submarine warfare, which is quite obvious will drive America into the war. Submarine warfare fails. You know, as a Luddite, they always say, never put your trust in technology. It's always wrong. You know, so that's the idea. So America is driven into the war, and America wins the war for the Entente, quite obviously. Now, what do the Americans win because they have won the war? The Americans don't win any territory. Maybe a few coral reefs in the Pacific Ocean, but I mean, basically no territory changes hands in favor of the Americans. As far as the Pacific's concerned, the war has an ending for the Americans that they don't like, because who is the big rival of America in the Pacific Ocean? Japan. And Japan's had a field day during World War I. All the European powers could no longer pursue their interests in China. They sort of withdrew from China, and Japan moved in. The whole of China was basically run by Japan for a few years. And that's not something that the Americans like. But that is partly a result of World War I. And then the Americans, you know, slowly try and make the Japanese withdraw from the parts of China they've occupied. So America doesn't really win anything in strategic terms. It does achieve parity in terms of battle fleets with Britain. So after the war, British and the American battle fleet, they have a separate treaty about that, the Washington Naval Treaty, which is one of the first arms limitation agreements that are so popular then after World War II, which says the British are going to have 15 battleships and the Americans are going to have 15 battleships. So they've achieved parity. But of course, that parity isn't really worth anything because Britain was never going to fight America anyway. It's quite easy to see why. I mean, Canada is part of the British Empire. If ever there were a war, Britain against the United States, for whatever reason, the Americans would simply occupy Canada. You know, that's a hostage of the Americans, really. So that sort of parity with Britain is really a matter of prestige, nothing more. What about finance? I mean, that's the trouble that so often in politics, we tend to think there must be something to do with money. Money makes the world go round. That's quite true. But so few people know about what actually happens in the financial world, and the financial world is not really eager to show people what happens. You know? So there's this sort of reluctance on both sides to come to terms with it. What seems to have happened, put it like that, is that The one thing that America won in World War I is they got rid of all their debt. America had been growing at phenomenal rates throughout the 19th century. From a fairly small country, around 1800, something like 5 million or so, in 1900, almost 100 million. And the biggest economy in the world. And all that has usually been financed by loans from Britain. So up to 1914, America is hugely indebted to Britain. And within 2 years of war, from the end of 1914 to the end of 1916, by supplying Britain with whatever she needs, America has succeeded in paying off that debt. So at the end of 1916, all these accounts have been settled. America's got rid of their debts. Without fighting, though, just by selling things to the belligerents. And after they enter the war, they then give loans to the British. And the British give loans to the French, and the French give loans to the Russians. And none of them ever sees any of their money back. I mean, the French give money to the Russians. We all know what happens in Russia. The Russian Revolution. Lenin's not going to pay interest to the capitalists. 20 billion francs, whatever that would be in euros these days, that French savers have invested in Russian railways. It's all gone. That's why the French then insist they need reparations from Germany. Not to rebuild northern France, but to pay their debts to Britain so that Britain can pay her debts to the Americans. The end of the story is none of them ever paid their debt. So whatever the Americans have invested into their victory in World War I, they don't get it back. So in these terms, really, America has certainly won the war, but did it profit from it? Not really that much. The one thing that Wilson and the Americans wanted, of course, was make the world safe for democracy. All right. The idea was have a League of Nations, because the Americans realized whenever there's a big war in Europe, America will almost automatically be drawn into it, because whenever there's a big war in Europe, you'll have blockade on one hand and submarine warfare on the other hand. And both of them will harm American trade. You can do it like Jefferson did in the early 19th century, say, all right, there will be no trade. But that means cutting off your own economy. Why should you do that? And that was what Wilson was afraid in 1914. If you're really going to insist on free trade, within a few months America will be at war with Britain, not with Germany, because Britain starts the blockade. So Wilson says we can't be all that neutral. And then they have this deal with Britain where they say, all right, we can no longer send our grain and our cotton to Germany. That's harming the American economy. So what you Brits have to do is, whenever the price of cotton drops below 10 cents, you've got to start buying. And even though Britain doesn't need any cotton in the war, they agree they will buy cotton. Because cotton is grown in the American South. President Wilson is a Democrat whose electoral base is in the American South. When the South wants King Cotton, they get it. So that's the idea. American economy is always sort of, will always be affected by war in Europe. That's why there shouldn't be any wars in Europe. And that is what Wilson wants. And he sets up this League of Nations so that you have what would be called collective security. Whenever there's any dispute between two sovereign nations, either the League of Nations will try and get a settlement, or if a war starts, everybody gangs up against the aggressor. That is always something that sounds very nice in theory and never works in practice. Because who is going to pay for that war against the aggressor? There will always be some people who have to pay for it and they don't want to pay for it. But from the very beginning, the United States does not want to take part in that system. That is partly President Wilson's fault, because he did not lead what today would be called a bipartisan foreign policy. Meaning Wilson is a Democrat, he should have taken some Republicans on board and taken them with him to Paris, and he didn't. So the Republicans will simply say no to that treaty. So the United States do not become a member of the League of Nations. And you have a famous speech given in the American Senate on that occasion by Senator Cabot Lodge, who was a sort of New England Republican, basically quite pro-British. And he said, no, if we were to join the League of Nations and have collective security, you know what the result would be? We might next year have to fight for the Hejaz against Saudi Arabia. No, they're doing that all the time now, but they don't like it even. So that's the idea. America doesn't want to be the policeman of the world. Question is whether they want to do that now, but that's a different one. We won't discuss that. In 1919, they don't. So you have this undisputably the winner, America, who doesn't really like the way what they've got. They haven't really got anything in material terms. If anything, they have acquired responsibilities, and they don't want these responsibilities. All right. Now, the second winner, of course, is the British Empire. The British Empire reaches its greatest extension. They acquire a few colonies, or rather their colonies acquire a few colonies. South Africa gets what's today called Namibia, and Australia gets part of New Guinea and some islands in the Pacific and all that. And the British get a few mandates in the Middle East that are very troublesome. They get Iraq. Who wants Iraq? I mean, these days we know that, but I mean, in those days, even then, the British military said, no. We don't really want Iraq. We want the port of Basra and the oil around it, but the rest of it, not really. What are we supposed to do with that? So, British winnings, they get Tanzania. So now you have a pink line on the African continent, a corridor from Cairo to the Cape. It's all pink. But who wants to walk that? You go by sea or by air. It's the idea that you sort of, bicycle your way from Cape Town to Cairo is really not a realistic one. So Britain doesn't really have any one grade. They've reduced the risks, that is true. They felt that the German Navy, what Churchill always called its luxury fleet, because, we British, we need a navy to keep our empire together. Why do the Germans need a navy? They need a fishing fleet, maybe, but not a navy, So they've got rid of the German Navy. The German Navy has to be surrendered to the British, and before it's being surrendered, they scuttle the ships in Scapa Flow. All right. They've also got rid of German colonies. All right. That is a big thing, a great thing for Germany, because one thing is quite certain about colonies: they cost money. Every German Minister of Finance will go down on his knees and thank the Lord for no longer having to pay for the colonies. All of them, even Namibia with all its diamonds, did not turn a profit, So the Germans don't lose anything by losing the colonies. Once again, it's a matter of prestige. Great stories, There are settlers fighting in Namibia and planting tobacco in East Africa, and having a successful campaign in East Africa, because the only German general who was not defeated in World War I was the one fighting in East Africa. And as he conquers Rhodesia in 18, he finds a newspaper that says the war is all over. All right. But again, that is prestige, that is stories, that is nothing that Germany needs or where Germany profits from. So Britain has survived. It's done away with a few irritations, threats like the German Navy. But one of the great British historians, George Macaulay Trevelyan, he wrote a book in the interwar years about the age of Queen Anne and the War of the Spanish Succession and all that. And I'm mentioning that because in the preface to the third volume he says, Britain in 1713, after that war in the Baroque age, very much where we are now, in the Baroque age in 1713, Britain was more powerful than in 1815 or in 1919. It's not that Britain has really increased its power. No. In financial terms, it now has to sort of share world leadership in finance with the United States. The City of London has to share that with Wall Street. In colonial terms, they've taken over part of the Ottoman Empire. That's more of a worry than anything else. So even the oil in the Middle East, most of it goes to American companies during World War I, all the Saudi Arabian ones. So Britain, the one thing maybe that is a good thing for Britain, and that is very ironic in the light of post-World War II developments, is Lenin and Soviet Russia, even though, of course, ideologically they're enemies, obviously, but in terms of power politics, Lenin, and even more so Stalin in the early stages, is far less of a threat than the Tsar was. That is why Britain and Japan don't mind Soviet Russia. Soviet Russia is fairly defensive. Soviet Russia in the early 10, 20 years does not indulge in any sort of imperialist policies. In terms of protection of India, the crown jewels of the British Empire, the Soviets do invade Afghanistan, but in 1979, that's 60 years later, you know, so there's less of a threat. The Tsar had an expansionist foreign policy. In the East, where they met Japan. In Persia, where they had this agreement with Britain. Tibet, Afghanistan. The Soviet Union doesn't. They couldn't care less about Central Asia. So for that is a little bit of, you know, a breathing space for Britain. But it's nothing you would fight a war for. So you have the two Anglo-Saxon powers who are really now top of the pile. But they haven't really profited that much from the war. And now we're coming to what for us, of course, is the really interesting part, the continent of Europe. It's clear to say who are the losers. The losers are partly the Ottoman Empire, which is reduced to Turkey, and of course Austria-Hungary, because it simply ceases to exist. That is not so much a conscious decision of the victorious powers. There's always been this polemic, not just from the Austrians, but also from Churchill maybe and some others who said, maybe it was a mistake to dissolve the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's not a matter of whether it was a mistake or not. It is not a decision that was taken in Saint-Germain and Trianon and all those treaties around Paris. That is a decision that's taken by the different nationalities of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who say, if we have the option of once upon a time forming a national state, the way the French and the Italians and all the others have done before, all right, let's try it. There is no way that Kramar or Lloyd George or any of them could have told the Czechs in 1919, for the sake of the balance of powers, please go back to the Habsburgs. No, that would not have worked. And the French and the British had not yet made up their mind what they really wanted to do with Austria-Hungary. It simply happens. And I keep quoting this marvelous quote from one of your sort of most clever politicians, Antonin Schwechler, if I pronounce him correctly, the leader of the agrarians, the biggest sort of non-socialist party in Bohemia, who said, you know, during World War I, from the first Battle of the Marne in 14 to the second Battle of the Marne in 18, we don't know how it's going to end. It's not like World War II, where for 3 years the Germans win everything and for 3 years the Germans lose everything. It's quite clear. World War I doesn't work like that. So what Schwechler says, we need a policy of 2 irons in the fire. So whatever happens, we'll be with the victors. That's because it's not, we don't decide the war. Austria-Hungary doesn't decide the war. That's being decided by Germany, United States, whatever. We just have to sort of look out what's going to happen. And whatever happens, we've got to be on the winning side. And that is basically the psychology with all the nationalities of Austria-Hungary. Of course, there are some nationalities who are advantaged. That happens to be the case of the Poles. After 1917, both the Central Powers and the Entente both say we want an independent Poland. Of course, the Central Powers want a pro-Austrian Poland and the Entente wants a pro-French Poland, but they all want an independent Poland. Maybe borders are a little bit disputable, but they want that. Even the Hungarians and the Austro-Germans have a fringe that says, why not have a national state of our own and forget about all the rest of it, even though they know it's more difficult in their case. So Austria-Hungary, as soon as it's quite clear that the war is lost, starts to disintegrate. July, August 1918, that's when you have the Czech political spectrum swinging towards Kramar. That's when you have the Austrians, even the Germans saying, maybe we can do without the monarchy. It's all falling apart. So Austria-Hungary has lost. The other great power that has obviously lost is Russia, of course. I mean, look at Russia before 1914, look at Russia after 1918. Russia has lost far more than Germany does. Russia loses Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, what today is Moldavia, to Romania, part of the Transcaucasian area. Question for a long time is, will they lose the Ukraine too? That's their most productive areas with the highest per capita income, they're all gone. On top of that, Russia has a civil war that lasts for 3 or 4 years with another millions of casualties and destruction. And Russia after the war is completely isolated because of the Bolshevik takeover. So if any great power, apart from Austria-Hungary, has lost the war, it's Russia. And that, of course, has a huge impact on the rest of Europe. Because if you look at the situation before 1914, we have this system of two alliances that have always been, potentially antagonistic and maybe will fight a war tomorrow. But for 40 years or 35 years, that didn't happen. On one hand, you have Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Central Powers, and on the other hand, you have France and Russia. And that is the balance of powers in Europe that more or less works. The Central Powers are better organized, but in terms of numbers with the Russians, of course, the Franco-Russian alliance is bigger. So Germany is highly industrialist, Austria-Hungary less so. France is a wealthy country, Russia is not. So add it all up, it's a balance. And then you have Great Britain that for most of the late 19th century enjoys what they call splendid isolation. The important thing is France that's been defeated by Germany in 1870. That was a surprise because in 1870 France and Germany had roughly the same potential in terms of citizens, 40 million each roughly, in terms of steel production, tiny at that time compared with Britain. So they were roughly equals. And the Germans won, you might say, because they were better organized. By 1914, it's all very different. France stays at 40 million people. Germany now has 65. Germany produces 4 times as much steel as France does. So Germany is much, much bigger now. And the only way that France can contain Germany, that they can achieve a certain kind of balance, is the big Russian ally. And that, of course, is the big thing in the run-up to World War I, that everyone knows about the strategic plans of the general staffs. So everyone knows that the Germans will say their best chance, maybe their only chance, is defeat France quickly, within the first 6 weeks or so, before the Russians can mobilize entirely. And if that works, then we can turn back and face the Russians, because they all believe Russia cannot really be defeated. And World War I is characterized by events that always prove the experts wrong. Whatever happens, the experts are always wrong. The Germans don't win the war against France, but surprisingly they win the war against Russia. No one's expected that. And this victory over Russia, Peace Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918, when Lenin signs away everything because Lenin believes that, within a few months, maybe years, we'll have world revolution and all that ceases to matter. So the borderlines between Germany, Poland and Russia, who cares, They'll all be swept away by the revolution. So Russia accepts her defeat in 1918, and that sort of defeat stays. And that means for Germany, she no longer has to face, in case of war, a war on 2 fronts. Germany is no longer, pressured between France and Russia. That was what Bismarck called the cauchemar de coalition, the bad dreams about a coalition against Germany. And when one of those explorers in Africa, Karl Peters, came to see the Chancellor, Bismarck, and said, that these great ideas and options in Africa, the Italians and the Brits and the Portuguese, and in between there's still space for us, why don't we move? Bismarck frowns, turns around and says, look at a map. Here's Germany, there's France and there's Russia. That is my map of Africa. You know, that's the one thing that matters. Germany is between France and Russia. After 1918, Germany no longer is between France and Russia. And the Russia that you've got, for the time being, it's a weak Russia, and for the time being, it's a pro-German Russia. After all, who sent Lenin to Russia? The Prussian General Staff in the famous sealed train. Who concluded an alliance with Lenin in August of 1918 when the Czechoslovak Legion almost toppled Lenin, and Lenin was in dire straits, and he had to sort of make sure he had German support? He actually concluded a formal treaty of alliance with Imperial Germany. So, for the Entente, they say, you know, there is no difference between the Bolsheviks and the Bosch, between the Russians and the Germans, they're allies, you know. So, not only has France lost a strong Russia as an ally, they've got a weak Russia now, and that weak Russia, if anything, will support Germany rather than France. And of course, the whole history of the interwar years bears that prediction out. I mean, you have the first Russo-German treaty in 1922 at Rapallo, which becomes a sort of catchword for that sort of continental alliance. You have a secret cooperation between monarchist, conservative Prussian generals and the Red Army throughout the interwar period. It's only Hitler that stops it, because Hitler is an Austrian, is anti-Russian. So, and of course you have in the end the Hitler-Stalin agreement of 1939 to partition Poland once again. So, France doesn't really have a reliable ally in the East. Of course, what it has got what they call the cordon sanitaire. You have a number of states now who've recently become independent: Finland, Baltic states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, that's become much bigger, Yugoslavia maybe. You might even say Turkey could be roped in, that have a sort of, you know, a circle around Russia. Kramar, the French Prime Minister, at one time says, what we need is like a sort of iron curtain. He doesn't use the term iron curtain. We need barbed wire around Soviet Russia to isolate it. And all these states, newly created states, they might provide this barrière de l'Est, a barrier in the East, against Russia, but also against Germany. But that, and statistically, that looks plausible. If you add up Finland, Baltic states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, Turkey, it's about the size of Russia. You can work with that, only you can't, because all these states will never agree on anything. You have a first inkling of that once the White Russians, the sort of counter-revolutionists, are defeated. You have a rather dramatic phase of warfare, what the Poles call the miracle on the Vistula. The Bolshevik armies march into Poland in summer of 1920, and they are turned back at the gates of Warsaw. 15th, 16th of August 1920. And of course, 15th of August, this is, of course, a saint day, so St. Mary's, and the Poles are very Catholic, so they will say it's divine intervention, all right. That's why it's a miracle. In fact, they were numerically superior at the time. But if you look at that war closely, what about Czechoslovakia at the time? Czechoslovakia had a dispute with Poland over Teschin. And the French said, if it comes to a balance, we support the Czechs rather than the Poles. Hungarians wanted to send some reinforcement to Poland. Czechoslovakia said, no way, we're going to let Hungarians enter the country. No. Lithuania, next door neighbor to Poland, and they had a dispute about Vilnius, of course. Lithuania even joined the Soviet Union. So there is no unity amongst these East European states. And Britain, who might have, whom the French always need as a support, Britain didn't like Poland. Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, he was anti-Polish for a number of reasons. So he said, rather than give territory to Poland, we'll have a plebiscite, so have a plebiscite in Silesia, we'll have a plebiscite in East Prussia, and the Germans win in any of these cases. And there's even this marvelous quote about Danzig and the so-called Polish corridor, the strip of territory that divides East Prussia from the rest of the German Reich. That is a sort of one of the points, it's not the real reason, of course, but it's one of the points where World War II starts then. In 1925 already, the British Foreign Secretary, Chamberlain, but not Neville Chamberlain, Austen Chamberlain, his half-brother, says, and he's quoting Bismarck here, "The Polish corridor is a bad idea, and it's not worth the bones of one single British musketeer. So we're not going to fight for that. If the French want it, all right, we think it's a bad idea, but we are not going to fight for it." So it's quite clear that all these barrières de l'Est, it's a very fragile number of states. None of them have any sort of, guaranteed borders. That is the thing about the Treaty of Versailles and all that, we often think about it's a new world order. No, it's not a new world order. It's just a treaty, Versailles, about the borders of Germany. And Saint-Germain is a treaty about the borders of German Austria. So it's a question about the rail station of České Velenice and things like that. But it's not a new world order. The real big question, where's the border between Poland and Russia? It's not being decided here. The British have a proposal, the Curzon line. It's disregarded by both sides. The Poles and the Russians settled that question, at least provisionally, in Riga in 1921. The independence of the Transcaucasian states gets lost. It's not in the treaty. The treaty with Turkey would have said, you have a huge Armenia. Lost. So, it's not a new world order. It's far more sort of defensive, really. And the big thing about, the big four is big five, then there are big four, then there are big three. So the five great powers who gather in Versailles or in Paris at the time. Wilson for the Americans, Lloyd George for the British, Clemenceau for the French. Then you have the Japanese and you have Orlando from Italy. Now the Japanese don't really matter. Orlando goes home because he doesn't get Fiume. So you've only got three. And that's when the British Foreign Secretary at that time, Arthur Balfour, who was a relation of the Cecil families, it's sort of the Schwarzenbergs of Britain, so he says, those three all-powerful, all-ignorant men. And, well, whether they're really all that ignorant, of course, they didn't know about the minor details about, Georgia or whatever. But the big thing is they weren't all-powerful. The idea is they won the war. And for the French, there's a sort of window of opportunity. You won the war in November of 1918. You still got a powerful army. The Germans have now basically surrendered. If you use that army to invade Russia, or rather to help the counter-revolutionaries in Russia, if you do that, you have a good chance of not restoring the Tsar because the Tsar is dead, but one of his relatives or a conservative regime that will rely on the alliance with France again. There is a certain window of opportunity. And if you look at the numbers, the Red Army under Trotsky, it had something like 200,000 men in the spring of 18, something like 700,000 at the end of 18, and something like 3 million at the end of 19. So if you move rapidly, you can do it. Not if you take a long time. On the other hand, you have Marshal Foch, who was, the supreme commander of the Entente armies. At the end of the war, he commands 200 divisions. That's something. In the spring of 19, he's down to 39. So the power of the Western powers is declining rapidly because the armies consist of conscripts who've been willing to defend their fatherland, but who are not willing to go on any sort of imperial ventures abroad. Once they try to do that, everywhere, Italy, France, Britain, you actually have small mutinies. People don't, all right, they sort of risk their lives for something important. Now, when the war is basically over, no one wants to risk their lives any longer, You have a similar situation with the Americans in 45. Very brave in D-Day. But in May of 45, no one wants to get killed in the last 48 hours of a war that's already won, so no risk. And the same is in 1919. The Western powers can't mobilize their own peoples to sort of, deal with the Russian question. And then you have all sorts of fancy ideas. The one I like best, of course, is by Churchill, who always had great ideas and who also knew how to write about them in an appealing version. I mean, the one thing he really deserves the Nobel Prize for Literature, far more than many of those who get it now. And what Churchill has in 1919, he has this appealing idea, Bulgaria, one of the defeated nations, basically. Bulgaria owes its independence to the Russians, who liberated the country in 1877. And you have all sorts of monuments in Bulgaria, even though they were opposed in the war now, to the Russians. Now, the Russians liberated Bulgaria. Let the Bulgarians liberate Russia now, and will invade the Ukraine and Russia with a lot of Bulgarian troops. And if it's successful, the Bulgarians will get some sort of part of Turkey for it, as a sort of fee. Doesn't come to pass. Then they say the Greeks should do it, but the Greeks want to fight the Turks, not the Russians. Then they said the Romanians should do it, but the Romanians want to fight the Hungarians, not the Russians. So there aren't really any willing people. The French say maybe colonial troops, Senegal or so, but doesn't really come to pass. So it all peters out. And during the winter of 1819, there's no fighting anyway, because in winter you can't launch any big campaigns. And then you have a last, hurrah for the counter-revolutionaries in summer of 1919. General Denikin marches on Moscow, and he gets something to 200 miles in front of Moscow. And then he's being defeated. As Montgomery, the great British general of World War II, says, there's one general rule of warfare: never march on Moscow. Napoleon, Denikin, Hitler all failed, so that doesn't come to pass. There's another white Russian general, Yudenich, who was the Russian commander in the Middle East during World War I. He starts from Estonia. And in October 1919, there are headlines in the Paris papers: Yudenich has taken Petersburg, we won. No, it didn't happen. That was a stock exchange scam. Some people on the stock exchange say, if we launch that notice, we know certain shares will rise, it will make a killing. Yudenich was stopped 3 miles out of St. Petersburg. So it doesn't come to pass. And after October of 1919, it's basically all over. The Bolsheviks have won. You should have moved, if you wanted to stop them, you should have moved earlier and with more force. But the trouble is, now that the Bolsheviks have survived, the Western powers failed to make friends with them. I mean, after all, everyone hates the Bolsheviks, but some of them, the Germans, the Turks, whoever, Chinese, will say, all right, who cares? Let's make an alliance. The French don't. Because they're too much wedded to Poland, after all, Romania. And you have all these French savers who say, if we recognize the Soviet Union, what we expect in return is that Russia starts paying interest on debt again. And of course, Lenin can't do that. So you don't have any sort of rapprochement between the French and the Russians. You have a little bit in 1935 that also includes Czechoslovakia, but it's very indirect. And you might say these two tendencies, either you defeat the Bolsheviks or you make friends with them. You have two very outspoken representatives of that policy, of course, in Czech politics. On one hand, you have Kramar, who owns a villa in the Crimea, or rather no longer owns a villa in the Crimea. He always says, to the French, you're kidding yourselves if you think you won the war. You've only won the war if you restore the Tsar. And of course, Kramar goes to see Denikin and he tries to work that policy, but he doesn't find anybody who wants to join him. And then, of course, you have Bennett, who is far more to the left of Kramar and says, let's face it, we have to make friends with the Bolsheviks sooner or later. But again, he does not find any great support in the West for that policy. So I once compared this French policy towards Russia in 1918, 1919 to this, medieval legend about Buridan's ass. Buridan, a medieval philosopher, who said, if you have an ass, a donkey, standing in front of two Heuhaufen, two, heaps of hay, and if they're all the same, then philosophically, the ass would have to starve, because it can't come to a decision to turn left or right to eat first, And that is in a way what France does. It's Buridan's ass all over again. You can either, defeat the Bolsheviks or join them. They do neither. And the result is that France doesn't really win World War I. Of course, it wins on paper. It's got the biggest army because all the others, and no longer have conscription. It has, up to the 1930s, 3,000 tanks, who are all rusty and no longer work, but they're all still in the statistics. They feel they are the one great power left. But basically, no. Again, Arthur Balfour, who with all his, snide comments, says, no matter what part of the Rhineland the French take, they'll never be more than a second-rate power. And that's true. I mean, the French produce, as we said, fourth as much steel as the Germans. They have a navy, a third the one of Britain. They are a second-rate power. And no one's really going to help them, least of all the Italians, who hate the French, and they have a sort of conflict in the Mediterranean. So they have an alliance with what's called the Little Entente. But of course, the Little Entente is very useful against the Habsburgs, who don't fight any longer, and the Hungarians. Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. But Czechoslovakia obviously has a problem with Germany, the others haven't. Romania has a problem with Russia, the others haven't. Yugoslavia has a problem with Italy, the others haven't. The Little Entente, formed in 1920-21 as a sort of loose alliance of those three newborn states, or enlarged states, it's only effective against Hungary, or maybe the spectre of a Habsburg restoration. We have this idea as late as 1936, when the Austrians have an idea of maybe getting Otto von Habsburg back into Austria. And the Prince Regent of Yugoslavia immediately says, if you do that, I'll march in. That's it. End of it. End of story. So it's effective against the Habsburgs. It's not effective against any of the great powers. So France is really without allies. And what the British tell them is, forget about Eastern Europe. Get on good terms with Germany. And American finance have the same idea. When the French march into the Ruhr in 1923, it upsets the business of America. As the President of America, Calvin Coolidge, says at the time, the business of America is business. And so Wall Street comes in and says, all right, we'll give you credits so that the Germans can pay the French, so that the French can pay us, but in return, the French withdraw their army, and it's going to be peaceful. So France no longer has that military option. Basically, by 1923, 1924, France should have left any delusion that they won the war. The one thing they can do is build the Maginot Line, huge fortifications in the east, so that they are no longer directly threatened by Germany. But as one of my favorite English historians, H.P. Taylor, whom I just, out of the corner of my eye, I met him before he died, he said, the Maginot Line protected France, but of course it protected Germany even better. Because you all know if the French are building a huge defensive monument, they're not going to venture out of that. So Germany knows they can do in Eastern Europe whatever they want, the French won't move. As happens in 1939, they declare war, but they don't move, because they stay behind the Maginot Line. So the result of all that is, we have a few winners who haven't won much, America and Great Britain, or the British Empire. We have losers, obviously the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Russia to a large extent. And the balance between France and Germany, however, is that even though formally the French supposedly win World War I, in fact, in strategic terms, Germany has won World War I. The victory of early 1918, that Germany has actually won the war in the East and has created the settlement of Brest-Litovsk that survives. That has not been done away with by Versailles. So even though the Germans are, of course, glum and they'd expected to win on a huge scale and they don't, and they're talking about traitors and they're talking about reparations and blah, 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 blah. All right. But in strategic terms, Germany has still won World War I. And that is why you have a world war, lasted almost 5 years, 10 million casualties, not counting the Spanish influenza, and it hasn't settled anything. The one thing you should have done, theoretically, and purely, if before the war, everybody thought Germany is a bit too powerful for the European balance of powers. Again, H.P. Taylor, he put it, all of Europe was overshadowed by Germany. Only Germany saw the more distant Russia shadow. All right, if you think that Germany is too powerful, then you should weaken Germany and strengthen Russia. What happens in 1918 is the other way around. You weaken Russia far more. Russia is weakened far more than Germany. So in the end, Germany has won, even though they didn't realize that. Thank you very much.